Oh, is Cornelia the one who just dropped out? So I will start the introduction and Cornelia will finish it. But we got to hear Adriana speak last fall in Port Townsend, Washington at the International Fungi and Fiber Symposium. And one of the things we like to do going to these bigger national events and international events is we kind of audition speakers. And so we heard Adriana and turned to each other and said, oh, let's invite her to talk to our club. And took just a little while, but we got her. And so Cornelia, I just talked about the IFFS part. So I'm going to be quiet now and you can finish.
All right. Yes, we heard Adriana when we were up there at Port Townsend, Washington, and said, oh my gosh, both Sam and I both went like, hey, we have to get her to come talk to our club. So I'm so glad you agreed. So I don't know, I had done something early. I slid across my mouse pad and it made me disappear from a meeting. So sorry about that. So Adriana is the assistant professor at New Mexico State University in the Department of Biology. And I really love how she's studying the impact of climate change on fungi and vice versa, and also how inclusive she is. She got her PhD from the University of California, Irvine in biological sciences. She also has an MS in ecology and evolutionary biology from University of California, Irvine, and then an MS in molecular ecology and biotechnology from the Autonomous University of Baja California. So I was particularly intrigued by how one of the projects you did, getting just the general university population interested in fungi. As a Mushroom Club president, I thought that was a great project, and it was really interesting to see how that went and hear about it. And as you know, our climate is undeniably changing and so many things are happening. I'm really excited to have you also talk about that as well. And just a very, we were both taken by, you're very engaging and inclusive, and just love that about you. So just want to turn it over to you, Adriana.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, I feel really honored and excited to be here today. And I'm so jealous listening to your mushroom walks happenings in the near future. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and how I came to be interested in mycology, even though I'm not really exposed to mushrooms ever. But anyways, it sounds like the club is really fun and I would love to be there in person. But I'm gonna share my screen. Yes. Okay. And today I'm going to talk about mycology for climate change, food, and inclusion. And wait a second, just let me disappear.
Somehow your sound is not working.
Oh no. Oh. Can you hear me now?
Sam, it's working for me. I wonder. Yeah, people else says, yeah, it must be. Did you do something to your computer, dear? I mean, nobody. For me. Yeah. So
yes, it's working. It's working fine. It was my fault.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Good. Okay. So I'm gonna start talking about very broad information about fungi and mushrooms, and because you're all really excited about mushrooms, maybe you already know a lot about this, but hopefully there's going to be some new information here. So you know that fungi are complex and intersectional organisms. A lot of people identify fungi because of the fruiting bodies that they see. As you can see on the right side panel, there's a lot of different and like wonderful morphologies that mushroom can have. But then there's the other part of the fungi, right? The fungi that we don't get to see that often. As you can see on the left side of the panel, you can see a lot of petri plates with a lot of fungi growing there. But the one thing that these two types of growing morphologies have in common is that regardless of whether the mushrooms, the fungi grow as mushrooms or as molds, the one thing that they have in common, the one thing that they have in common is that they grow as a mycelium, most of them, right? Because we know that there are some exceptions where some fungi will grow as pseudohyphae or maybe yeast, but most of them grow as mycelium. So whenever I'm talking about fungi, I really invite people to think about fungi in the broader sense and think about the mycelium more so than only the fruiting body. And of course, one of the things that most people find really fascinating is the different morphology that fungi have, which show, not only how diverse they are, but also how spectacular they are visually as well. Let me just hide my video panel. So, here's one exception on the way that some fungi grow. So these are yeast. You can see them in the microscope and they just look like balls. But then there's all sorts of different types of fungi. You can see some desert adapted fungi here. These are some that I collected from my backyard a couple of years ago. You already know about the multi-million-dollar industry behind edible truffles. There's some fruiting bodies that look really like extraterrestrial and as if they were not from this earth. And there's some other very particular fruiting bodies, one that resembles an ear, one that resembles a dead man's hand, one that resembles a geometric figure. And my personal favorite is bird's nest, just because I think they are so unique in the way that they look and the way that they grow. And there's some other more nasty ones like the regular mold that you find whenever you leave something on your counter for too long, or the type of infection that you would get on your nails. So just the diversity of shapes that mushrooms, that fungi have, it's really impressive. And something that I like to also mention is that fungal ecology is really nuanced. For example, we know about symbiotic fungi, so specifically ectomycorrhizal fungi. We know that they develop relationships with plants, and these relationships are really beneficial for both organisms, for the plant and for the fungus. The fungus cannot live without the plant, and the plant cannot live without the fungus. But there's also this other side, and that's what I mean about nuance. Fungi can also influence plants in a negative way because there are plant pathogens. So there are many fungi that will infect the plant and cause a disease in the plant. So instead of having a beneficial relationship with the plant, they have a negative relationship with it. We can see something very similar happening with animals. For example, maybe you've seen leafcutter ants before, and there's a misconception that leafcutter ants are carrying the leaves to actually eat them. But no, what they're actually doing is that they're carrying the leaves because this is how they grow the fungus that they feed off of. So basically, the ants are carrying the food to feed the mycelium that they end up feeding off of. So this shows another type of relationship where there's a beneficial relationship between an animal and between a fungus, where the fungus is being fed by the ants, and then in turn, the ants are feeding off of the fungus. But then there's also the other side of the story, where there are a lot of fungi that are pathogenic for animals as well. In this case, they're pathogenic to ants. So there are some pathogenic fungi that will infect the ant and will kill the ant. So again, showing this nuanced relationship between fungi and living organisms. Fungi are also economically and culturally important. There are so many products that we have thanks to fungi. Some of these products are soy sauce, for example. Soy sauce is the product of the fermentation by a fungus. We wouldn't have chocolate if it weren't for fungi. The process of fermentation of the cacao bean is very, very complex. And it's not only fungi who play a crucial role here, there's other microbes as well. But there is one crucial step. And there's actually some research on this, which is really interesting, where you can see the succession of the microbial fermentation process. And one of the final steps in the process of fermentation is fully dominated and carried out by fungi. Whenever some of the most complex compounds need to be broken down, fungi play a crucial role in there. So we wouldn't have chocolate without fungi. We all know that yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, plays a crucial role in the production of beer and of bread. We have specialty cheeses thanks to fungi, like this one right here. This is blue cheese. So if you were to zoom in into these greenish, bluish spots, you would see a bunch of mycelium and of spores from Penicillium roquefortii. And even I had a child last year. And when I was looking at the formula that he was eating, drinking, there was something that caught my attention. And it said M. alpina. And I was like, no way, no way. I'm going to double check, but I just don't think that this is going to be real. But it was, and I ended up finding out that Mortariella alpina, which is a fungus, it's used in the production of formula because it's one of the only organisms that you can extract arachidonic acid from. So arachidonic acid is an essential fatty acid that we need for the development of our brain and of our body overall, but mostly of our brain. And usually you find this type of nutrient in meat, like fish, like beef, but then it would be really expensive, right, to extract arachidonic acid from those organisms. It would be really destructive as well. So someone found that Mortariella alpina happens to produce arachidonic acid in really high quantities. So then arachidonic acid from M. alpina is included in infants' formula. So I thought that was it just really blew my mind. Also, fungi are the meeting controls appeared again, and I couldn't read my slide. Fungi are really historically important as well. So they've played a crucial role in the history of many different cultures, and I'm going to talk about one of the cultures that I'm familiar with, and that is the Aztec culture. So as many as you probably already know, the Aztec people would use mushrooms to connect with their gods. One of the mushrooms that they use would be psilocybe, different species of psilocybe, and again they would use this to connect with their gods. And this process in general and mushrooms in general were so important for the Aztec people that you can see drawings of the ingestion of Tionanacatl. So Tionanacatl is how they call the mushroom. Tio means God, and Nanacatl means mushroom. And all of these processes was so important that there is a drawing of it that you can find in the Codex of Magdebeciano. And if you think about it, back then, we're talking centuries ago, people were not just drawing anything, because drawing was something that, it was It was only something that very special people would do. Pigments were really difficult to find, were very expensive. So they were just not drawing whatever. They were drawing really, really, really important information and important processes and important ceremonies. So the fact that there's multiple drawings about people investing Tiwanaku really shows the importance of mushrooms for this culture. Another thing that's really important is that the green pigment was really difficult to obtain back then. So then anything that was painted with green signifies very, very important and sacred things. So the fact that the mushrooms were painted with the color green, again, really signifies the importance of the mushrooms for the Aztec culture. And then it was not only the drawings of people investing mushrooms, but also Xochipilli, which was the god of dancing and of partying in a way, has multiple symbols that historians believe are showing the importance of mushrooms once again. So you can see here in the earrings of Xochipilli, these are supposedly the caps of mushrooms. And then these figures right here are also showing the caps of mushrooms as well. So once again, the fact that the god of dancing in the Aztec culture has symbols related to mushrooms, once again, signifies the importance that mushrooms had for this culture. And every time someone joins the meeting, the meeting controls appear, and then I can't see the screen. Sorry about that. So if I pause, it's because I'm trying to hide the control bar. Another thing that you maybe already know is that the Aztec people, something that was really important for them was corn in the growing of maize. And once again here, fungi play a really important role. So there's something called chawisle. So this is how the Aztecs called the fungal pathogen that would infect the mice. And chawisle, it's Puccinia triticina. So again, a fungal pathogen. It's I believe it's a type of rust, and this is really interesting to me because in Mexico we have a saying that it means "Ya nos cayó el chawisle." So if you were to translate that, it means something like "the chawisle has fallen upon us." So it's a way. It's actually kind of funny because it's used in a kind of like in a negative way. So for example, if you're having a great time in your office with your colleagues, your coworkers, and then your boss walks in, then you would say that. You would say, "Oh, ya nos cayó el chawisle," meaning like, something that it's not really nice. It's coming towards us. And this is kind of like, it comes from the Aztecs whenever they had to deal with this terrible fungal pathogen that would infect and devastate their cultivars of maize. But then going back to the nuances of fungi, there's also another fungal pathogen, which is Huitlacoche. And this fungal pathogen looks really, really horrible, but it's actually really, really delicious. And this is Eustolagomades. And it's once again a fungal pathogen that infects the corn, but instead of being something negative, it's actually something positive. And it's something that it's a traditional dish, especially in the center and in the south of Mexico, that is very common. I'm from the north of Mexico, so I feel jealous about because we don't get Huitlacoche that much in the north of Mexico as you do in the center and in the south. But once again, showing the importance of fungi in the culture, all the way going back from the Aztec culture to our current culture, where we still use chawisle and we still eat Huitlacoche, which happen to be fungi. And fungi are an essential part of many culturally relevant theories. Maybe some of you already know this as well. Maybe you're already familiar with ergot fungi, which right here is growing on rye. So LSD, the hallucinogenic drug, is extracted from ergot. So there's this one theory saying that the Salem witch trials were really the result of a woman ingesting rye that had been contaminated with ergot. Also, probably some of you are already familiar, but there's this huge interesting theory connecting Amanita, the mushroom, with Santa Claus and with Christmas. There's a lot of information on the internet, and you can really go down the rabbit hole looking into all of these different theories that have been created by very, very passionate mycologists. And fungi are becoming the staple for sustainability. So there is a product that it's a bio-based material made of mycelium, and it resembles leather, as you can see here. And then here you can see some things that have been produced with this leather, like a wallet, like a watch. There's an Adidas tennis shoes that was created made of this bio-based material, and actually in the ad you can see some oyster mushrooms right here. I don't think this is available to like the general public just yet, but I think some celebrities are testing these tennis shoes, and there's a lot of hope for the creation of a biodegradable material that is also animal friendly. There's the, what are they called? They call them like ecological burials, where this box right here is made of a bio-based material, again based of mycelium. It's more of a stronger material compared to the leather, but the whole idea is that the coffin is made of a bio-based material. So the way that it would work is that you would put the body of a deceased person inside here. You would bury it, and then everything would decompose and would integrate back to the land. Not only the body of the person, but also the bio-based material of the coffin, and the soil and the microorganisms inside it. There's other alternative for packaging, which is this one you can see here. This is also a bio-based material that promises to protect a very fragile material without having to rely on unicell or foam, for example, which some of it can be biodegradable, but it just takes a really long time for it to disappear. And of course, another staple for sustainability are the many different pigments that you can extract, not only from mushrooms, but from fungi in general. So there's a lot of microscopic fungi, like Fusarium, for example, that produces some really, really intense and vibrant colors that are not as damaging to the environment to produce. And this is, I like to show this because this are a pair of gloves that I knitted, and that I dyed the yarn with all of the different pigments I was able to collect. And then also fungi are a great source of nutrition. So you can see here what the spoon soya fibers look like. You can see what chicken fibers look like under the microscope, and then here you can see what mycoproteins fibers look like under the microscope. And what you can see is that the fibers of the mycoprotein are more similar to those of chicken compared to spoon soya. And you can see some dishes here that you can make with some fungi, and then you can see the nutrition facts here of the different types of fungi. And something that it's really kind of like important to highlight here is that mushrooms are some of the only sources of certain vitamins that you cannot find in vegetables or plants. So for example, vitamin B, it's really difficult to find in plants, but it is present in mushrooms. So in a way, for vegan people, mushrooms happen to be one of the best sources that they can have. and where they can get these nutrients from. I think someone's drawing on my presentation. I don't know. I see some drawing. I'm not making those. So I'm not sure who's making them. And then finally, there's this really nice paper that I would be really glad to share with. If anyone's interested, if you put a reminder in the chat, I promise I'll share it with you. And it's a wonderful paper, sort of like showing all of the different uses that fungi have in all of the different industries, going from agriculture to aerospace to food to construction, and so on. It was a really exciting paper to read, and it really gives me hope for the future of our products. And with that, I'm going to finish the very first part of the talk. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So I actually did have a question. I was wondering, did you say fusarium is responsible for a lot of vibrant colors? I wasn't sure if I heard that correctly.
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's true.
What colors are you familiar with that fusarium is responsible for?
Yeah, so we've seen, I guess, some of the most vibrant ones that I've seen. It's like this one right here, like fuchsia. It's one of the colors that we've seen. We don't find it in, all species of fusarium, but just some of the strains that we've collected have fuchsia colors, like purples as well. So it's mostly along this kind of like gamma of colors, like pinkish towards purples.
Okay, Sam, do you know if you're drawing on the screen? Because
I just texted you. No, I'm not. Marcia said it. We're being Zoom bombed. I mean, somebody who's on is messing around.
I was thinking only the co-host could do that.
Sorry, it was me. Sorry, I don't know what the heck I touched on the screen, but I was trying to close the thing, and I'm sitting there drawing random little blue-green lines. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
I like that you made a smiley face.
So the other thing I was curious about is which mushrooms you use to dye to get the colors on the mittens that you made.
I don't remember, but I'll get those to you because that was a while back. And I was I am an amateur mushroom pigment person, so I can't remember the names right now, but I'll share those with you in an email probably.
Okay. We might be able to annotate the recording too. So
yeah.
We could add that in later. So great.
Yeah.
And then Jonah has a question. Does the nutritional value of mushrooms vary much between types and or families?
So according to most of the studies, slightly, but I don't think the difference is that significant where you would only eat shiitake because it has like significantly more protein than oyster. It's not like that. So it does vary a little bit, but it's not significant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the talk. I think I'm not going to worry about the purple dot right now. So what about phytonutrients? Do you know if there have been many studies around any of those with various fungi?
Oh, that's so interesting. I don't know. I remember a colleague of mine was looking at the endophytic community of lettuce. I think he was only looking at the diversity of fungi, but I hadn't thought about how the endophytic fungi could affect the nutritional value of plants. I don't know if anyone's looking into that. That's actually a great question.
And for those of you that don't know, I mean, there is a category of fungi called endophytic fungi that live inside of plant cells or in between the walls. And they actually are often responsible for a lot of the kind of compounds that plants have that we're interested in, like healing compounds or scent compounds or whatever. It actually, like for Taxol, for instance, they found out that it was actually the fungi in there making the Taxol rather than the yew itself. So so then they were able to extract the fungi and not kill the yew to get the fungi, to get the Taxol out of it, which was great. So so anyway, it's just something I'm also interested in too. So
I had two comments. Two is when you were showing some nutritional value and you had the three different, like USDA or whatever, nutrients, those are all the same mushroom, right? That the button and the cremini
Yes.
and the portobello are basically all the
Yes.
same mushroom.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if everyone else knew that. And then the other thing is, I think one of the things that can vary is the protein content of mushrooms, and that specifically the little straw mushrooms that are tropical that grow so fast and you get in Thai soups, that one is 33% protein. So
Yeah, we've seen a few charts on that, so it's possible to look that up. And the reason that other chart, the sort of the mushroom growing community here that grows all those Agaricus bisporus, they have some funding to fund those kind of studies. So
Awesome.
okay.
Okay, so shall we go back to full screen and part two?
Yes.
Sounds good. Okay. And are you seeing my slide only? Okay. So I'm from the north of Mexico, as I mentioned. I was born and raised in the north of Mexico. It's in the desert, so in the Sonoran Desert, if any of you are familiar with it. So when I decided to study biology, I did so because I felt really fascinated. I have a bachelor's in biology. I felt really fascinated by landscapes like this one, so very different from the landscapes that I was used to. I was really fascinated by all of the visible biodiversity, all of the plants that you could see, and all of the animals living with these plants. And back then, I never really thought about what was beneath all of this visible biodiversity, and that was really sustaining all of that visible biodiversity. But as I progressed in my degree, I learned about soil biodiversity and how important it is for sustaining, again, all of that visible biodiversity that we often see. And soil biodiversity it's really huge. For example, in this relatively small piece of land, so if you imagine that this drawing, it's a block of soil, a block of land that you would get. So in a relatively small piece of land, you would get approximately 50 kilometers of mycelium of approximately 500 different species. You would get approximately 100 billion bacterial cells of approximately 10,000 different species. You'd see around 500 meters of roots of plants of approximately 10 different species, and you get what I'm saying, right? So you'd also see, or you'd also expect to find algae, protozoa, worms, insects, and so on, even mammals in some cases, like rodents or moles, for example. And in my career, I became really, really fascinated specifically by fungi. And within the kingdom of fungi, I got really interested in soil fungi specifically. So what are soil fungi? So these are fungi that inhabit the soil, and in a single teaspoon of soil dirt, you could find thousands of different species, many spores, a ton of mycelium, and you wouldn't be able to see it. But sometimes you can if you're lucky. So for example, here, this is a branch of wood, and you can see all of the thick threads of mycelium right here. In some other cases, you can see the very sort of like traditional fruiting body that we all think of, with a very traditional shape that we're all familiar with. And then some other times you can also see them even though they don't have the traditional shape that we all think of whenever someone says the word mushroom. But this is a fungus. It is a fruiting body of a fungus, and it is visible to the naked eye. But a lot of the fungi that I work with, and a lot of the fungi in general, it's invisible to the naked eye. So you would never see it because they never make visible fruiting bodies. But if you were able to grab a little bit of soil and sprinkle the soil in a petri dish with culture media, then you would be able to see a lot of different fungi. And these are all different species of fungi that we isolated from desert soils. And then there's lots of other fungi that are out there, and we know they exist thanks to molecular techniques like DNA, but we just don't know what the species of fungi are because we've never been able to isolate them with microbiological techniques. They don't make visible fruiting bodies. So we just know that there's a ton of biodiversity out there that has not been described, but that we know that it exists because we have been able to quote unquote like see it with their DNA sequences. And to jump a little bit more into my research study, into the research that we do in my lab, as you can imagine, it's really difficult to study the invisible. So for example, in this picture right here, what can you say about the right side of the picture? So you can say that the plant is suffering, it doesn't have any leaves. You can say that the ground looks really in bad shape, it's really eroded. It doesn't have any plants, so it's probably not healthy soil. And then on the other side of the picture, you could say the opposite, right? You can say that the plant is doing really well. It has a lot of leaves. The ground looks healthy as well. It has a lot of grass. It's green. So in general, you can say a lot of things based on what you see. But what could you say about the microbial community in the soil? So you can't really say much. You can assume things. You can say, well, probably the microbial community on the right side is struggling and the one on the left side is doing really, really good, but you can't know for sure. You can just assume things. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of things that we cannot do that you can do when you research plants, for example, or when you research animals, or when you research anything that you can see. For us, it's not like that. We cannot we cannot follow the life cycle of the microbes in the soil. We don't know how many offspring they're having. We don't know when they're dormant, when they're active. There's just many different things that traditional ecologists and biologists do that we cannot do because our study system is invisible. But regardless of fungi being invisible, it's really, really important that we study fungi because studying fungi allows us to understand, plan, and mitigate for the effects of climate change. And actually impacts to the fungal community can result in all different sorts of things. So if you think, I'm going to use the word global change drivers to refer to impacts. So this can be changes in temperature. It can be changes in the amount of water that the soil is receiving. It can mean all sorts of different things that you can think of. I'm going to refer to those as global change drivers. And impacts to the fungal community by global change drivers can result in all different things. For example, it can result in millions of dollars lost in crop losses that would impact food availability. So for example, if a global change driver like global warming, if it happens to benefit fungi, pathogenic fungi that infect crops, then we would have losses of crops, and this would impact food availability. It can also result in the disruption of the carbon cycle. So fungi have a crucial role in the cycling of carbon in our ecosystem. So they're responsible for keeping nutrients flowing between our atmosphere and our soil, between our plants and between our animals. So global change drivers have the capacity to impact the carbon cycle in a way that it could change the emission of greenhouse gases, specifically of carbon dioxide. So global change drivers could, for example, cause an increase, or global change drivers could impact the fungal community in a way that, for example, it could increase the emission of CO2. And then global change drivers and impacts to the fungal community can result in loss of biodiversity that can result in threats to public health. So once again, if, for example, anthropogenic activities or warming or nitrogen pollution or any sort of global change driver that you can think of, if that happens to impact the soil fungal community in a way that causes loss of biodiversity, that could open things up for fungal pathogens that can cause diseases to people. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. And this is what motivates me to study fungi and how they respond and adapt to global climate change. I'm really motivated to use them as tools because they help us understand, plan, and mitigate for the effects of global climate change. So we do a lot of different things in my lab. I'm just going to talk about an aspect of what we do. But if you were to visualize what my research program looks like, this is what it would look like. So you see this right here, which is a small ecosystem. If you think about global change drivers impacting the fungal community, these impacts to the fungal community can have impacts at the species level. So, impact like one single species of fungi, or it can also impact the whole community of fungi. Whatever the impact is, this has repercussions at the ecosystem scale. So again, it can cause a loss of biodiversity, impacts to greenhouse gas emission. These changes that are happening at a larger scale are going to feed back onto the fungal community once again. And this once again is going to cause impacts to the species level, to the community level. And this causes kind of like an infinite loop where the fungal community impacts ecosystems, ecosystems impact the fungal community impact ecosystems, and so on. And that feedback loop is what we study in my research program. And all of this is really important because looking or researching the fungal community under this infinite loop kind of lens has implications for public health, food availability, and sustainability, which are three topics that I'm very passionate about. So I'm going to talk about some of the research that we do in my lab. So in my lab at New Mexico State University, we do research with fungi, and as you can see, the landscape looks very, very different from other parts in the United States, probably very different from the landscape that you are used to. And drylands are really, really important ecosystems. So my university is located in the middle of a dryland ecosystem, which is this Chihuahuan desert. So if I go outside of Las Cruces, which is the city where I live, if I go outside of Las Cruces, this is what I see. So I see the Chihuahuan desert. And drylands are really important ecosystems, the Chihuahuan desert included. And dryland ecosystems are known for, they're very vast. So they cover approximately 40% of the Earth's surface. So a lot of people think about dryland ecosystems, they think of them as not being important, which to me it really blows my mind, because how can something that covers almost 50% of the globe, it's not important? These ecosystems are home to 2 billion people. That means that 1 in every 3 people in the world inhabit a dryland ecosystem. They house 44% of the world's cultivated system. So that means that a lot of the food that a lot of the people around the world eat is being grown in a dryland ecosystem. They also serve as rangelands for livestock. So there's a lot of wild animals inhabiting these ecosystems. And dryland ecosystems are known for being for having sparse vegetation, although not super obvious from these pictures. This is just Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico. This is the Sonoran Desert in Mexico. This is the ecosystem that I call home. And okay, compared to a forest ecosystem, maybe they don't have that much vegetation, but they look pretty vast in my opinion. And another thing that they're known for is that they have temperature fluctuations throughout the day, where it can be really hot at noon and then it can be really cold at night. And they're water limited, so there's not a lot of water available in general. It doesn't rain very often. There's not a lot of humidity. And they're also known for being very diverse. So they house a ton of plant species, animal species, and microbial species as well, including fungi. And Drylands are being affected by global climate change. So there's a misconception that drylands are not being affected by global climate change and that only forests are being affected. This has to do, it has a background on colonialism where, colonial principles kind of like instilled the idea that only forests matter and that only forests are impacted by anything. But in general, drylands, they're super important as well, and they're also being impacted. And specifically in the Chihuahuan Desert, we are being impacted by two different types of global change drivers. The first one is drought. And as you can see in this map right here, this is I got it from Drought Monitor. So this is a really cool tool where you can monitor drought in the United States every day. So I accessed this map on March 1st. So if I were to access the map today, it would look slightly different. So the areas that are red and orange are the areas that are currently going through drought. And these colors can change day to day. But what doesn't change very much are these letters right here. So the L's, as you can see here, and this here. So these letters are indicating areas of the United States that have been impacted by drought for a really long time. So L stands for long-term drought. And in the southwest of the United States, where I live, there's two areas that have been struggling with drought for a really long time. One of them is the whole state of California, and the other one is this part right here, and this is exactly where I live. So the area that I live in has been impacted by drought for a really, really long time. And the other global change driver that's affecting our ecosystem is land degradation. And in the Chihuahuan Desert, land degradation looks like this. So it looks as a transition from a grassland-dominated ecosystem to a shrubland-dominated ecosystem. So you can see here, this picture is from April of 1920, and you can see that there's a lot of grasses right here, and there's barely any shrubs. But then in July of 2001, so this is the exact same area, you can see kind of like the opposite, where you barely see any grasses and you can see a ton of shrubs. And this process of desertification has been caused for a bunch of different things, including overgrazing is one of them, and the other one is drought. So the combination of overgrazing with drought has caused that these shrubs, which are native shrubs, which also happen to be like drought resistant, they've started to grow over native grasses. And these has all sorts of different implications, and these land degradation is really contributing to dust storms, for example. It's really contributing to the erosion and degradation of arid lands just in general. And even though this picture, 2001, is kind of old, this is a picture that one of my students took a couple of months ago, took it with a drone. So you can see that the landscape is pretty patchy. So you can see a lot of shrubs right here, and you can see barely any grasses. So again, the two global change drivers that are impacting the Chihuahuan Desert mostly is drought and land degradation. And what about fungi in dryland ecosystems? So that's another misconception. There is this misconception that there are no fungi in deserts, and that is wrong. There's a ton of fungi in deserts. A lot of them you cannot see unless you use microbiological techniques to isolate them, and you can see a couple of them here, but then some others you can see. So these three are desert adapted mushrooms that I've seen in my field sites. Every time that I go out to the field, I see at least a couple of desert adapted fruiting bodies. So there is a bunch of them. You just have to pay attention. And, with all of this in mind, thinking about global change and how it's affecting dryland ecosystems, and thinking about the fungal community in dryland ecosystems, I went to the Jornada. So this is a long-term ecological research site, which is located right here, right outside of Las Cruces, where I live. And this site is really nice. It has global change experiment that it's mimicking global climate change. So it's kind of like worsening drought and worsening land degradation, kind of like emulating the type of ecosystem that we're going to have in like 50 to 80 years from now. And this experiment is really simple. It has rainout shelters to mimic drought. These rainout shelters, they impose an 80% reduction of incoming water. And then we also have, we impose disturbance with these vehicles, with these rototillers that they mimic vehicle damage, but they also mimic like overgrazing, dust storms, and so on. And then, so some pieces of the landscape are being degraded with this disturbance. Some others have the rainout shelters, some others are left untouched, and then some others have both the rainout shelters and the disturbance. And the question that I wanted to address here is, what is going on with desert fungi under global change, and what are the potential consequences to our society? So to address this question, we did a bunch of experiments. We extracted DNA of the soil and also RNA. So these are different molecules. One of them tells you kind of like the identity of the fungi that you have in the soil, and the other molecule tells you what the fungi in the soil are doing. And what we saw is that under global change drivers, so under drought and disturbance, and the combination of drought and disturbance, we found an increase in fungi that cause disease to plants and animals. Specifically, we found an increase on these groups of fungi, these species of fungi, which are Naganischia, Didymella, and Pleochida. So Didymella and Pleochida are two facultative pathogens, and facultative pathogens are organisms that can be pathogenic and cause disease at some point in their life cycle, and then they can be saprotrophic and just, cause no harm in another part of their life cycle. And both Didymella and Pleochida happen to cause disease sometimes to some plants. And then in the case of Naganischia, this is a facultative pathogen, but it causes disease to animals, humans included. So again, it can cause disease to animals sometimes, and then some other times it won't. But what's really interesting is that we found an increase of all of these fungi only when they were exposed to the global change drivers of drought and disturbance. And this type of research that we do in my lab, we don't do it to alarm people. We don't want to, we don't want people to get depressed because there's no hope for humanity under global climate change. We do it because we are seeing that fungi could represent a threat to public health under global climate change, and because we cannot prepare for something if we don't know that it's coming. So this is why we do the research that we do in my lab, because we want to make sure that as a society, we are prepared to deal with whatever's coming our way. And we know that certainly difficult things are coming our way. Here you can see some articles that have been published in the past few years. So there was one article in Scientific American that says that the fungi are the newest emerging microbe threat all over the world. Climate change and the emergence of fungal pathogens, and this just means that there's going to be more fungal pathogens that we're going to be seeing in the near future. And this all is really important, including the research that we do, because there's a lot of hypotheses saying that global warming is responsible. By global warming, I mean not only the increase in temperature, but also changes in like precipitation events and all sorts of different things that are happening with global climate change. There's a hypothesis saying that some pathogenic fungi are emerging because of global warming, like Candida auris, for example. This is a pathogen that emerged in, I think, around 2011. So we didn't know about this fungus before 2011. And then all of a sudden, multiple people in different parts of the world started to get sick with Candida auris. And the hypothesis of how Candida auris happened to come to existence is related to global climate change. And then there's similar theories about fungi that cause disease to crops. So again, one of the reasons why we focus on this in my lab, it's not because we want to scare people, but more so because we want to be prepared for what's coming. In my lab, we also work on the development of translational components via partnerships. So something that's important for me as a person and that I like to contribute to with my research is, making things that can help us with sustainability goals. And one of the things that we do is that we collaborate really closely with the mushroom farm in La Mesa in New Mexico. So this is a local mushroom farm, and it's the only farm that we have in southern New Mexico. And as you can see, the U.S. mushroom market is really increasing. It is projected to increase by 9.4% by 2030. So just in 8 years from now, we're going to see an increase in the mushroom market. And if you see, this graph is really interesting because you can see that food, it's the light blue color. You can see that the food market of mushrooms is actually a small portion of the market itself. You can see that pharmaceuticals are another small portion, but then cosmetics are really the largest portion of the mushroom market, because there's a lot of molecules that can be extracted from fungi in general that are good for antioxidants and all of those different things. So you can see here food, mushroom food, you can see pharmaceutical, and then you can see a cosmetic, like Origins has an entire line that it's called, or that it has like mushroom components in it. And as many of you probably already know, growing mushrooms generates waste. So mushrooms are great, and we're going to be seeing a lot of mushroom stuff in the next few years. And all of these stuff that we're going to be seeing relies on the growth of mushrooms, which happens to generate waste. And the waste that mushrooms, the growth of mushrooms generate is called spent mushroom substrate, SMS. And one of the ways, so these, you can see here how mushrooms grow, right? So you can see here mushrooms growing. This is one way they can grow. Not all mushrooms grow like this, but this is one of the most common ways. So they grow in like a block of wood chips, mixed with other things, right? So, you inoculate your wood block, and then you harvest your mushrooms, and it's awesome. And then maybe if you're lucky, you can flush the wood block maybe 2, maybe 3 times, maybe 4 times if you're super lucky. And then after that, you're not going to get fruiting bodies anymore. And the wood block is going to turn into a spent mushroom substrate. And it doesn't matter what you do, no more mushrooms are going to grow in these spent mushroom substrate blocks, because the mushrooms they've consumed all of the carbon that they like. And the only thing that's left is the type of carbon that they don't like. So there's no way that you're going to make mushrooms grow here. And one of the ways that we thought we could use these spent mushroom substrate is by composting. And this was an idea that the owner, Full Circle Mushrooms, Jimena Zamacona, had. She was like, what if we use spent mushroom substrate and turn this spent mushroom substrate into compost, so that people can use this compost in their gardens and in their farms, and we're going to be reusing something that had no use anymore. So this is what the spent mushroom compost cooking looks like in Full Circle Mushroom Farm. And this is what the spent mushroom compost looks like when it's ready. So as you can see, it kind of looks like dirt, right? So the way that my lab contributed to this is the spent mushroom compost really a good alternative for compost? So what we found, and we again did a bunch of experiments where we were growing different plants with different types of compost, and one of those composts was the spent mushroom compost. And what we saw is that the spent mushroom compost was increasing the root development of locally important crops like onions and like marigold. So here in southern New Mexico, the growth of onions and marigold is really important. So we wanted to see if the spent mushroom compost was aiding in the growth of these plants. And we saw that, yes. We saw that whenever you grow the plants with local soils only, the root development is not very large. But when you add the compost, actually the root development is really good, to the point where it's comparable to the root development that you would get with commercial compost, which happens to be more pricey. So we're still in the process of doing some experiments with this, but we've been getting some really interesting results. And we think that it's going to be a very promising way to reuse the spent mushroom compost to grow locally important crops. So that was the second part of the talk. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them before I go to my final and shorter part of the talk.
Okay, so Michael has a question about whether there could be any nutritional value left in those SMS blocks. Like, could they be used in an animal feed supplement or something like that?
I don't know. I'm not really sure. Probably yes. And actually, one of the things that we're doing at the moment is that we're measuring the nutritional composition of the wood blocks to get a sense of like what type of carbon there's left. You know, if there's nitrogen, how much of it there's left, if there's phosphorus, because we really have no sense of what the fungi are consuming exactly. So we are going to have a little bit more information about that in the next few months.
Okay. And then Mallory had a question about how do mushroom farms normally dispose of their SMS?
Yeah, my understanding just with chats that I've had with Jimena, my understanding is that most mushroom farms, and she's not the only one trying to develop a compost of the waste, but my understanding is that most farms will dispose of it, you know, in throwing it in the landfill. Jimena's farm has been has been functioning for 3 years. So there's a bunch of piles of spent mushroom substrate in her farm. She doesn't want to dispose of them in the landfill, but I think that's how most other farms deal with the waste.
So I do also have just something to share with you that one of our former members who moved to Seattle, he's originally from Vietnam, and he did an experiment with one of his cousins in Vietnam where he made some holes about 6 feet apart and buried a bunch of those blocks in the holes and then planted like a jackfruit tree on top of it. And he was able to get fruit. And this was also land that was in really bad shape. It had been treated really badly, and it was his experiment to micro-remediate. And they were able to, his cousin was able to give him one of the fruits in 3 years. Like, it had gone from, you know, soil not able to grow anything to growing these jackfruit trees and this big jackfruit. And
oh, that's awesome.
he said the soil got crumbly. Like, it wasn't just where they planted or put the mushrooms. It was like everywhere. Now that's a completely different climate, I know, but it was a very exciting experiment.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think there's a lot of future and hope on this too. When we were doing, because we did most of our experiments in the greenhouse here in my lab, and we actually, it was really interesting too, because we got a bunch of mushrooms growing in the soil, and we collected soil samples throughout the experiment, because I would like to do, because we were seeing some very interesting like succession events too. Like, first we saw kind of like a crust of microbes developing on top of the soil, and then that kind of like opened things up for like some mini mushrooms, which were not the mushrooms that they were growing in the farm. It was something else. So I think there was like a really interesting like microbial processes and dynamics happening in the soil at a small scale in the greenhouse. So I bet that happens at a larger scale in the wild as well.
Right. And the other thing I understand from mushroom growing is the plastic for the bags is a big problem. And so
Yeah.
I know that Unicorn, the company that sells most of those, has actually supposedly developed a biodegradable kind of
Oh,
plastic.
good.
So I don't know if your farmer is aware of that or not, but they do, of course, cost more.
I do know that Jimena's looking into ways of, not using plastic anymore, or like changing the practice, her practice in a few years, but I'm not entirely sure what, I guess what she's thinking on about that.
Right. We had one more question just pop up. Jeanette was asking about the chart that you showed with commercial mushroom uses of commercial mushrooms, like
Yeah.
cosmetics was the highest. Is
Mhm.
it dollar value or volume that was showing? She was wondering.
No, it was dollar value.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay.
Okay. So I'm gonna move on to the last part of my talk, which is that learning about fungi is important for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I carried out a workshop in my lab, or a project that I called Mycology for Climate Change, Food, and Inclusion, a case study on the importance of exposure to increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of mycology. And I was really driven to do this project because in the area of mycology in academia, which is the area where I'm in, there's not a lot of diversity in terms of the backgrounds of people, in terms of their ethnicity, their race. It's really, really white dominated, and it's really male dominated. So this was something that kind of like caught my attention, and I was like, like what's going on? Like why isn't that we have more diversity in this discipline? And I think it's probably related, a lot of it is probably related to exposure. And that is because the perception of fungi is associated to exposure. And exposure is limited in people inhabiting ecosystems where mushrooms are not common. As I mentioned, I grew up in the desert, and actually I didn't see a mushroom until I was like 11 years old. And I was so impacted. It was such an impactful event in my life. The very first time that I saw a mushroom, that I remember the day. I was like visiting my cousin, and her neighbor happened to have like a small front yard with a piece of grass, and there was a mushroom growing in that piece of grass. And I had never seen one before. I mean, I heard about them, and I'd seen them in my pizza, but like I had never seen one in real life. And I remember my cousin and I were just like there, touching it and being like, oh my gosh, it's like, what you see on TV. So for those of us who grew up in desert ecosystem, it's really, really difficult for you to actually see a mushroom. Even if you live in places where, there's rain and humidity, if you live in like very urban and densely populated areas, chances are that you are not going to see a mushroom either. Exposure is also limited in people from historically excluded communities. So again, people, a lot of people of color, people from low-income backgrounds, and just people that don't have the means to know about mushrooms and fungi, even less. Because if you think about it, whenever children are exposed to nature, it's the nature that they can see, right? So plants, animals, and so on. So one of the ways that you can be exposed to mycology is if you see mushrooms. But then if you don't live in a place where you don't have the means to maybe go to the forest and mushroom hunt, then it's very likely that you're not going to be exposed to that. And then first generation and low income students, as I mentioned. So, people that come from families with, limited education. If you think about it, again, like fungi it's becoming more of a mainstream topic, but it didn't used to be mainstream. So I am a first generation college student, and my parents had no idea what fungi were, except whenever you talked about disease, right? Like, oh, like my food got, contaminated with mold or whatever, or someone has athlete's food, like they would think about fungi in that way, but they didn't really know about the importance of fungi in life in general. So you can imagine their faces when I started to get interested in like fungi and wanted to do a master's degree on fungi and a PhD on fungi. They were really very, very confused. And thinking about this, I applied to Interchange Ambassador Award that is offered by the Mycological Society of America. And I proposed a workshop in my university, New Mexico State University, that for better or for worse, fulfills all of the exposure is limited in. So NMSU is located in the Chihuahuan Desert, so in the middle of the desert. Approximately 60% of the students are Hispanic students, so people from historically excluded communities. And my university is a first-gen forward institution, meaning that most of the students are first-generation students and most of the professors are first-generation college students as well. And there's many, many, many low-income students as well. So I was awarded the Interchange Ambassador Award. And with that, I started my workshop called Mycology for Climate Change, Food and Inclusion. And the workshop is really simple. It consists on giving a kit for students to grow their own edible mushrooms. And we also give them a kit for them to do their own myco-fermented food, which is tempeh. And then we give them a few lectures on mycology for climate change, mycology or the diversity of fungi, and the importance of fungi for our society. So kind of like the same things that I talked about today are the things that I talk to students as well. So just introduce them to fungi, to their biodiversity, talk about the importance of fungi for our society, and then talk a little bit about the research that we do in my lab, which is fungi and climate change. And then once we've completed like the lectures and students have a chance to grow their mushrooms and make their tempeh, we give them an exit survey. The average participant is a 22-year-old Hispanic cis heterosexual female from a low-income household who is a first-generation college student who grew up in the Chihuahuan Desert, also known as the Greater El Paso area, which consists of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, El Paso, Texas, and Las Cruces, New Mexico. So all of those three areas are known as the Greater El Paso area. And these students had a very little prior knowledge about fungi. So in a way, most of the students that have participated in this workshop fulfill all of the things that I knew that were associated with limited exposure to mycology. 85% of the students successfully grew mushrooms, 79% successfully made tempeh, and the activities that they enjoyed the most were, of course, growing mushrooms. And the other thing was learning about the importance of fungi in society and how fungi are intersectional organisms. So learning a little bit more about the nuanced ecology of fungi was something that they really enjoyed learning about. And then I collected all of because I give them like a space for them to write, about their feelings about the workshop. And then I collected all of these words and made a word cloud. And the words that you see the most are mushroom, thank as in thank you, fun as a fun project, great experience, enjoyed this opportunity. So a lot of very positive associated words just in general. And then I looked at some of the students' quotes, and this was one of my favorite parts. So for example, one student said, "I really enjoyed partaking in your research. I found that I have an unrealized interest for mycology." Another one said, "Thank you so much. This project was fascinating, and I feel it opened my eyes up to all the possible ways that fungi are used in day-to-day activities." And then another one that says, "Thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate in this little at-home research lab on mycology. It gave me more of an interest to continue outside research on fungi and the diverse role that they have in our society." So overall, it was a very successful pilot project, and I'm really, really excited to let you know that just last Thursday, I got a notice of award for a grant proposal that I submitted where I have plans to expand this research. So I'm very excited. In the next 3 years, I'm going to be doing this workshop again, and I'm going to be collecting more data, more of a quantitative data to do some statistics and to, get some robust data to show that these types of workshops really help in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I hope that I've convinced you that by studying the diversity of fungi, by including them in our science, by having a broad vision, by understanding their intersectionality, and by promoting inclusion, we're contributing to the understanding of life on Earth now and for future generations. And with that, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for staying here until the end of my talk. This is my lab. These are my students that do most of the work. And that I'd be very happy to take any questions if there's any.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.